Hi, everyone. My name is Mastana Moradam. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the executive director at Cross Cultural Expressions. And I would like to welcome you to this series of YouTube videos created by Cross Cultural Expressions in partnership with the Access for All Deaf, Hard of Hearing, Blind, and Physical Disabilities Underserved Cultural Communities Subcommittee of the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. During these the series of 6 YouTube videos, we will be exploring a variety of topics related to the intersection of deaf, hard of hearing, blind, partially sighted, visually impaired, and physical disabled individuals' lives as it relates to mental health, well-being, and the accessing of mental health services. This is an opportunity for members of these communities to sit together and discuss concerns, share resources, and give insight as to the work that can be done to keep individuals and communities uplifted and living their best lives. Before I allow our wonderful panelists today to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about themselves, I wanted to make sure to share with everyone the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health's Access Helpline phone number. For mental health resources and support, please call the 24/7 helpline at 1-800-854-7771. I'll repeat that number. It's 1-800-854-7771. So first of all, thank you all so much again for being here for part 2 of the Access for All panel discussion about the deaf and hard of hearing community, and for sharing your insight and wisdom and your stories with us. I wanted to invite our 2 wonderful panelists to introduce themselves and tell us just briefly a little bit about your background and your connection to the deaf and hard of hearing communities. And I think last time we started with Héctor, so this time we could start with DeMarco.
Okay, so let me explain my background first. I have an all-white background. I am a Black gentleman, African-American, Black glasses. Of course, I have eyebrows and I have a beard that's Black. I've got on a watch and a Black watch and a silver bracelet. I also have braces. Now let me introduce myself. My name is DeMarco. Last name is Pittman. I am deaf myself. I was born that way. You know, it was a 9th generational deafness. So the strong deafness that's in my family. I'm definitely involved in the deaf community as far as with learning how to provide mental health services related with oppression, and taking that and growing from not being oppressed to becoming equal. And definitely having, as far as getting our community together. And of course, that's the goal, is to grow our community. So thank you. This is myself, DeMarco.
Thank you so much, DeMarco. Héctor?
Yes, hi everybody. Héctor Ramírez. Happy Disability Pride Month. Before I start, let me give a little visual description of my background. I have in my Zoom background the Disability Pride flag behind me, and I'm wearing a red shirt with the logo for the United Farm Workers. I'm 47 years old, and I have long hair pulled back in a ponytail. I am Chiricahua, Apache, and Mexican, and I live here in the Tongva territory in Los Angeles County. I'm a client of the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health, and currently I'm one of the co-chairs for the Access for All USCC. And I serve on the board of directors for the National Disability Rights Network up in Washington, D.C. And I'm a person with disabilities. I'm autistic. I was diagnosed earlier on in life, and I have a mental health disability, and I'm hard of hearing. My first diagnosis was as a toddler. my mental health diagnosis came earlier on in my life, before I was in my 30s, and then my hard of hearing diagnosis came back late in the 30s. And I'm really glad to be here with all of you. I'm very active in the community as a disability rights advocate.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for your introductions. So in our last video, we discussed a lot about, the discrimination that happens and concepts around ableism and autism, and really tried to describe what accessibility should look like, especially when trying to get mental health services. Both DeMarco and Héctor also discussed how that discrimination and the lack of accessibility and living as a deaf or hard of hearing person in a world that isn't made for deaf and hard of hearing people, how that really creates mental health issues such as depression, certainly anxiety, certainly brings up a lot of frustration and anger that is a lot of times very hard to live with. This time I wanted to kind of bring the questions back to what each of you do internally for yourselves to deal with the frustration and the anger because of the systems that are set up and the way that are set up. Obviously, we do these programs because we want voices out there to create change in the world. And so that is certainly a priority. But I'm wondering, and I would love our viewers who are experiencing a lot of the same things that you are, to kind of gain insight as to what each of you do internally to uplift yourselves and to make, your lives, better and nicer, and create feelings of joy and happiness despite what is happening externally. And we could start with Héctor, if you're ready.
So internally, there's a lot of like good things and bad things that I do internally to deal with this. Okay, so I think just kind of clarifying that, like some of the bad things is like I eat my stress. So I love to cook, which is really good. But then I'm also a midnight eater, snacker. So that's not a very healthy thing, but I do that a lot. But no, I have two toddlers, a 3-year and a 4-year-old, which is a lot of work. And so it's built into the self-care that, I've learned to self-care through my toddlers, the importance of self-care. If I'm not having to take care of myself, I really would struggle to take care of them. So that kind of gave me a different idea of how to take care of myself. So now I do a lot of yoga, and I've been doing weightlifting because it's like very simple. I got a couple of weights. And so even when I'm doing meetings or like before meetings, I'll like pump up, and just to get the blood going. And I love to say that I love to run, but I don't run. I just love saying that, which is a very good thing too. You can say that you love doing things that you haven't done yet. That's a good thing, because it gives you something to think about. And then lastly, I have a garden outside, a small little garden. I think I heard somebody said once that planting a garden is believing in tomorrow. And so those are the things that I use to kind of take care of myself. Besides advocating, I do advocate, but that is very consuming. That is at times very rewarding, but it's also can be very frustrating. So I try to like pick every little single reward and that I get and have it sustain me. And connect with my community. Community for me is medicine, wherever I can find it.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love that. DeMarco?
Yes, hello. Of course, naturally, just being born deaf, we have, or just being deaf in general, we have good and bad things that happens, of course, but internally, that's what's cherished the most. I have been exposed as far as a younger with people and whatnot. And of course, when it comes to mental health and the success behind that, of course, it would be reading a book is one thing. Getting out with family, having family time, socializing, um, doing some exercising, that helps with mental health as far as weightlifting, like Hector mentioned. And then being involved with the community, like maybe we have a food, everybody just brings in a special dish and we all share our food. And that kind of inspires the other person and then inspires yourself as well to keep going. And that it alleviates, it doesn't necessarily resolve the hell that's going on, but it's mental health where it can definitely improve that. It's not a quick resolution, but for my activities, I think that's just definitely what's been best for me. And it's been small improvements, but there has been improvements. Now, some of the bad that I may discuss, it's as far as ignoring it or just resisting the issue as far as related with toxicity and just as far as just keeping going with those regular activities when things may come up as far as those suffering situations when it comes to mental health. You have to do the things that I mentioned, like read a book, get out, be with your family. And that definitely improves when it comes to your life and your mental health situation. So that's my comment for that one.
I recently had someone who is also suffering from a disability tell me that depression and also the lack of accessibility leads to a lot of isolation. Can you, either of you, talk about, dealing with isolation that might be created because of the disability and also the depression that comes as a result of it? And how have you worked through it? How do you motivate yourself to, push through that? Because both of you mentioned community as being so valuable in your mental health journey.
Yes. I want to mention, I have a lot to say about that topic, but as far as depression, I haven't experienced that, but I do have many family members who have experienced and other people in the life, a person, let me emphasize, who is depressed or isolated. And here's an example. As far as someone who is isolated and being alone, they're deaf and they have like being born into a hearing family. You're thinking like, well, where's the deaf individual's access to communication? And that becomes pretty depressing. And that happens often. But as far as a person who, another person who's depressed because they're isolated, they're alone, well, how do we approach that to alleviate that, to make sure that your mental health is well in order? Maybe learning about yourself, or focusing on specific inspiring words, communicating, and just letting that, maybe being hired with a job. Here's another example with being hired with a job. They'll become depressed because they'll say, well, you can't do this job because you're deaf, or you can't do this job because you have a disability. Well, then they become depressed from that. And then here's another example, as far as with maybe they're in a situation and they're the only deaf one, so they're being made fun of and laughed at. And it's like, well, that's another situation. And then as far as with laws and whatnot, it's just been a whole different types of tumultuous situations when it comes to, as far as making sure that we have access and everyone is aware of that word, as far as the ABCs of mental health and the programs that we've learned behind that. Because if you feel depressed, well, how will you resolve that when it comes to mental health? What do you do? And then having that program available, they'll say, maybe somebody deafblind who's hard of hearing, who is learning, and they'll add that into their program and curriculum. So that's just kind of what I think about and what's kind of happened.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Hector?
Actually, ask me a question again, please.
I was wondering, for someone who, because of the depression, is feeling isolated, or because of the isolation is feeling depressed, and since both of you had remarked how really being with community and kind of getting out there and being active helps uplift you, how would you, what would you suggest to someone who is really isolating and is having trouble getting out there? Like, how do you motivate yourself to move through it?
How do you motivate yourself? When you're ready, I encourage people to find community. I try not to push them. People have to be ready. And even the disability or in the mental health space is the same thing. Uh, I, I don't like, I think I heard a comment that people will suffer for their disability. And I think that's not necessarily, that's something that I had to learn and accept, because I have different, just like I'm also queer, so I come from I have like marginalized communities, and I think a lot of it really sometimes has to do with accepting where you're at and who you are, and it's not a very easy thing, and claiming it and owning it. um it's something that is very different from everybody else, and it's because of the way society is. It's not because it's a journey that we all have to go through. It's because society forces us to do this, and that's why community can be so healing. First of all, not only can you find others like yours, but I think most than anything, we're all looking for a place that is non-judgmental, a place where we are welcome, a place where we can learn about ourselves and others, where we can make mistakes and not be punished for that, and recognize that. And I think that's something that mental health and disabilities have in common, because there's nothing wrong with disabilities. There's nothing wrong with having certain mental health conditions or symptoms. Some of them are part of who we are. Some of them are very much a part of what has happened to us or where we've been and what we face. That is very important to acknowledge them and recognize them. As a gay man, I don't necessarily just celebrate my queer culture, but I also acknowledge like the homophobia that we have, and I find community with others battling that. In the disability community, the same thing. Like, I remember I've been institutionalized and hospitalized and multiple times while trying to get services. And the one thing that I know works for me the best is not medication. It's finding people just like me. Like when I would go to the hospitals and I would be in the wards, it was just so relaxing, not to be in the hospital, but be around other peers where we weren't being judged or name callings, where we could understand or where we could sympathize with the situations. That was the healing part. And it took me a long time to understand that the reason that sometimes it felt good to go to the hospital, because after a while I wanted to go to the hospital, but that's because I sought that non-judgmental supportive space, and I had to find it outside. I had to help create it and sustain it. But it is about finding it. You know that old saying, you're one in a million? Have you ever heard that?
Mhm.
Well, in this world, we have almost 6 billion people. That means that there's a lot of people out there just like you, and or that are like you. And it takes compassion with yourself. It takes patience with yourself. It takes kindness with yourself to discover those things about you that are out there, that are worthy of love, that are worthy of respect, that are worthy of patience, that are worthy of just taking up space. That saying, taking, and it's hard sometimes for people that are hurt, for people that have been hurt, to know that they have a right for that. And so it's a process. It's something that happens for some people a lot easier than others. It's a process that happens multiple times for people. And it's a process that sometimes it's not available to others. And sometimes looking for those communities, we realize that those are still not the actual communities that we're looking for, you know? And so and that's why sometimes it takes creating those spaces yourself. I think the disability community, we've always done that because we have always been the not normal, the not worthy, the undesirables, the burdens, but we're not, and disability in itself, in all its facets, it's a part of nature, it's a part of life. And to deny it, to include it, is one of our biggest mistakes. But I think it's something that we're learning, but it comes at our expense. But just like we celebrate like Queer Pride Month in July, I think it's also important to celebrate like Disability Pride, because it helps to recognize, it's not like we have to have pride, it's like we are, you have to kind of find that if you're depressed, it's hard, it's very difficult, and I know that very well, but it's part of life, it's not permanent, and it brings other parts to it as well. Sometimes it helps you to really look differently at those moments of joys that you have when it lifts up, and sometimes it's very hard to capture those, and so it's very difficult. It's like, instead of looking at things through a deficit base, like you've lost or you don't have, focusing or trying to adopt a strength-based approach. I might not have that, but I have this, and boy, can I do something with this. Or I might not be able to do that right now, but I can do this with what I have right now. It's a surrender that we're forced to do. Resiliency, I love that word, but I also hate it because we're forced to be resilient. And I don't want anybody, if in the future, to have to be resilient. I don't want to. Yeah, that's one of the things that I just, that's the real problem sometimes with disability, that we have to be, it's that we have to try harder to overcome some of these things because of the way that system is not built for us or including at us. Yeah. Did that make sense?
Oh my gosh, you had so much, like, I think, important, wisdom and everything that you said. I mean, just starting with that idea of acceptance of yourself for your own sake, and then to be kind and compassionate to yourself and patient with yourself, I think is so important, because as a therapist, I so often watch people, not just from the disabilities communities, but everyone, who are so hard on themselves. And, I always tell them, like, would you ever talk to like a child the way you talk to yourself? Because you have to have that kindness and compassion and patience with yourself. So I think that was brilliantly said. And then, of course, taking that to the idea of celebrating the strengths and not just looking at the disability, but really looking at how much ability that you have, because everybody does, and to really make that the focus and to share that as a focus with others. And then going from there to this idea that, um, you know, as you have compassion for yourself and as you do all these things with yourself, you can uh, give that to others. And so, even that resiliency that you're absolutely right is forced upon you really does also become your strength at some point, which is incredible. And so, I think really looking at the world from that perception, beautifully said. Thank you for that so much. Really appreciate it, Hector. Uh, I do want to focus a little bit, because we're, so lucky to have DeMarco here. And DeMarco, you mentioned that you come from an intergenerational family who has experienced hearing loss and deafness. And you also mentioned in our last uh, video that we did that you were mainstreamed in your education as a child. And so I'm wondering, because this is something that comes up a lot, especially with parents who have children with disabilities, is that question of, is it better to mainstream in the long run, or is it better to put them in with schools and systems that, you know, have their people who have the same sort of disability? And so I'm wondering, can you share a little bit of your personal experience as a child growing up? Like, what was it like being mainstream, the positive, the negatives? And if you had to make the choice for yourself now or for your child now, what would you do?
Well, that's a great question again. Okay, so of course, with generational deafness, when it comes to deafness, just in general, there are institutes. There's mainstreaming. You can be placed into a public school, which is mainstream, and that's what I did. I was 3 years old when I went to the mainstream of schools. So then through that process, I did learn as far as there was deaf and hard of hearing school that's mainstream. And as far as it was like let me explain this. Elementary, there's a middle, and then there's a high school. So, okay, again, so this school is mainstream. And first, the priority thing is the education. That is what we have to really focus on first. So my parents, they tend to, parents tend to want to just put them straight to the Deaf Institute. But you have to see to make sure that the deaf individual is happy and that they are accessible, getting accessibility at their school. So for an example, here's an IEP and a list of other things that could be happening, but maybe the IEP seems to be pretty, not, it was weak is what I signed, but so then they just put them straight into the institute. And then so it's something like, okay, they're embarrassed at this point. It's not the right match for them. And that causes mental health issues along the line. So when it comes to their parents, they decide and say, when they're born, they're gifted, they have to see that. Like myself, my parents saw that I was gifted and they put me into a mainstream school. And then, that's the education as far as when it comes to deafness and whatnot. But you have to but you can't make it where the deaf person thinks that they know everything. There has to be time where if they need that, take time to do that with classrooms and whatnot, but don't isolate them. So when my parents did find out about the isolation that happened, they complained. It should be in a public school, in a public classroom with hearing individuals and deafness. It should be mainstreamed, and there can be an interpreter provided at that point. So that was the point as far as related with mainstream. They had to set up their system as far as with only having that one classroom that was available. They had to make that accommodations to make it better and for all those other individuals for the future of the school. So I definitely think mainstream is better, to answer your question. And these are my reasons why. The education, of course, I've been mentioning is important. That is one of the most important things. But as far as with, a deaf, a blind, or, a disability, whatever it may be, they have to be happy of their area and follow what they think is best for their child. That's the priority, as far as that's the parent's responsibility to figure out what is best for their child and where they're at their level. Is it mainstream? Is it putting them in the Deaf Institute? But for my kids in the future, of course, public mainstream school. That's where I'm going to put them first. And if they're not happy, if they're having some issues, discrepancies happening, then of course I'm willing to put them over at the Deaf Institute, because I just want to make sure that they are happy. That is the goal first as well. Again, as far as the parents, let me make sure I emphasize the parents are the ones who are the priority with making decisions for their children. So they'll see if they're in the mainstream, they'll make sure that they're happy and satisfied with the education there. And if they're not, they will remove them and put them over into the Deaf Institute or a different school at that point. So as far as mainstream and Deaf Institute, I just want to emphasize that those are two different schooling styles. And the educational programs are both different as well. So yes, that's something that I definitely wanted to mention. And thank you so much for that question.
Beautiful, beautifully said, because I think so often people, parents in particular, look to kind of the education system and the teachers to guide them, and not that that's wrong, but I think really shifting that to look at your child and see what they're feeling and how they're doing is equally as important, if not more important, because I think that you're absolutely right. I mean, one child might thrive in the mainstream and another child may not and might require the other. So important to really have that communication as a
That's
parent,
exactly right.
advocate as a child. So thank you for that, for your children. Thank you for that, for sure. Um,
You're welcome.
my other question to you is, can you tell us a little bit about now growing up in a household, because your experience is so unique, or maybe it's not, maybe it's just unique for me, but growing up in a household where your parents are also deaf and hard of hearing, as are your grandparents, what was your community like? What was it like being in that family for you? How did the world view your family? How did your family view the world? Like, can you talk a little bit about just being raised in that environment?
And that's for me, DeMarco,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Okay. um, well, the environment, it was definitely a strong, tight knit environment because we were all deaf and we signed just and it was a strong cultural bond. But I want you to understand that the personalities were very diverse. There were all types of different personalities. So some, you know, they may have you know, may have had trauma before or abuse that had happened, jail. Let me think of another example. You know, it could be whatever it may have been that had happened in their life, but we're still a tight niche family, and the environment. It seems that there was some freezing. I'm sorry, but that environment, it was one of those that we had to just go through it and kind of just make our way. I definitely noticed it was a lot of just kind of pushing through our emotions, kind of just pulling them down and not saying much. And that was happening pretty often, more and more. And then when it came to myself, I saw the world was changing. So they pulled me into that and what was happening. And so that was definitely happening to myself as well. And it's called family division, family suffering, excuse me, where they pretty much just have whatever that generational suffrage is, it'll be kept into that family. So that was what I was wanting to mention. But as far as communication, yeah, we were communicated fine. It was all right. We were all at home just signing away, you know. So that definitely communication was definitely open and did happen there.
I think you're referring to that intergenerational trauma.
That is exactly what I was meaning. It had been passed down, generational trauma. Exactly right.
And so you really, it sounds to me like uh, were very important part of breaking that cycle of that intergenerational trauma for your family.
Yes, you're absolutely right. It's called that this think of it as like the circle where I broke out of it and kind of changed the ways of it. Um, you know, and I look at others who may have experienced trauma and being involved in that with fighting in their rights and family. You know, I understand that it did happen to us. It did. So just breaking that, yes.
I'm going to ask a question, and if it's too personal, feel free to tell me to butt out. What do you feel you did different to break that cycle?
Okay. Keeping my heart open, I know my family, they're great, they're wonderful. So the reasons why I just wanted to keep um as far as that generational curse, I didn't want to keep seeing that to happen. So at the same time, it was an emotional thing too, because I didn't want to break my family niche, that cycle there. So it was a process. It was a challenging try for me. And it was the style that had to be changed as far as the new generational positive mindset being passed down. So from from the past, we try to clean that up. And once we clean that up, we will go on to the next issue to try to break that cycle. So has been my process through it. But it's been wonderful process, but at the same time, it's still an emotional draining process. So
Absolutely. Absolutely. I congratulate you on that. I know that that is not the easy task. So really adopting a different perception is amazing. One that maybe differs from what you're told by the family. Thank you for that. Hector, I want to ask you, growing up in the, Latin and also the American, Native American culture, what are the cultural views, both being more collectivist types of cultures, what are the cultural views that were held by your community and your family around being deaf and hard of hearing, and also the other physical disabilities that you have encountered in your life? I know that, coming from Iran myself, a lot of times families tend to go towards, let's hide it, let's not talk about it, let's keep it a secret. So I'm wondering, within your community and your culture, what was your experience and your family's response to these challenges that you were facing?
It's different for for the different types of disabilities. Like I'm autistic and I was in the spectrum, and earlier on as a kid, it wasn't looked up as a disability. Well, we actually in earlier in my family, the native side, um, disabilities were never really looked at as disabilities, but as gifts. Um, and it I didn't know that I was disabled in my native family. In my Mexican family, yes, that was different. There's that cultural difference. It was a curse, a punishment, ask for forgiveness of God, that sort of thing. But it's the colonization aspect. Uh, with the mental health, it's also very different. It was like the devil. I need to ask for God for forgiveness. I must have been doing drugs to have developed this mental health condition. In the Native community, it was very different. It was both looked as a consequence of the trauma of the environment, but then also a part of who I am. And again, as a gift, the hard of hearing element in my Mexican family was challenging, but they understood that it was part of the trauma of the racism in the system, but also very difficult sometimes to accommodate, because at least in my cultural sphere, those accommodations really don't exist as much as they do in the Western world. We have deaf and hard of hearing folks in the Mexican community, but it's a totally different thing. I know Mexican Sign Language, and my Spanish is very good, but that doesn't necessarily translate, for example, when I need to use it in the English community. Now, hard of hearing in the Native community, that's something else, because it's not deafness, so I'm not completely there. And we have lots of deaf people in my Native community. We have some of our language, but we don't have, there's a big resistance to learn American Sign Language or even to participate into that culture. And so it tends to really sometimes be very isolating. It's the fear of venturing outside of the tribal community because of the historical trauma makes it very difficult to develop those disability identities outside of Native culture where it's not so safe. And as a result, a lot of the accommodations don't really exist in Indian country. And so we deal with a lot of the non-accommodation stuff. And so sometimes it's having to navigate between those worlds. It's exhausting as a person with a disability. So I really have to kind of pick the most comfortable for me. And I was thinking of like the education example. I'm pre-Americans with disabilities. So when I started school, I didn't have a choice. I had to go to a segregated school, and that meant that the quality wasn't always there of education, but some of the specialization, that's one place it was. And I wasn't integrated into high school, and it was like a big difference. It was like, wow, and I was like the first person in my family to graduate from high school because it was mandated that I go to school. I was the first one to go to college. And that was a different field because there were no accommodations in college. And it was that's why I really had to fight for accommodations in higher education. And it just became like a constant part of the identity that I had to do to be in society. So, it's interesting. It's we want people to feel welcome and loved where they are, but sometimes what we need to be able to be in those spaces is not there. So sometimes we have to separate ourselves in order to be able to survive. And that it feels like you're ripping a part of you, or that you're leaving something behind. It's almost like having children and having to choose to leave one behind so that the other one can survive. And it's like a guilt. It's like a grief. And I don't have a word for it. That's why mental health terms are so different. That's why it's so difficult sometimes to talk about mental health, because there's not a lot of words for the feelings or the experiences, and that adds to the challenge. But I think I got lost in your question with that metaphor. So,
Yeah, no, I mean, that is beautifully said. I think you're absolutely right. Going back to what DeMarco was saying about intergenerational trauma, and that moment where you recognize that you do have to kind of give up something in order to gain something new. And I think you expressed it really well, Hector, in that the difficult part in that is the guilt and the grief you feel for what you're giving up. And so, yeah, it makes perfect sense. And really thank you for sharing that. As we start to wrap up the second segment, my question for both of you is, what is the best piece of advice that you have gotten from someone, a loved one or a mentor, or anyone in your life that you would like to pass on to our viewers right now? And also, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us as we start to wrap up? And we can start with DeMarco.
Yes. I feel very honored to be invited, to be a part of this podcast, especially as a deaf individual and represent the deaf and hard of hearing community. Now, I do remember a comment that's been stitched into my brain, and it was the 95%. 95% is you doing well, and 5% is you understanding. And that becomes 100%. So you have the best energy that's going to happen regardless. I mean, you have the best energy regardless what's going to happen. So if it's family, friends, mutual respect, pets, whatever it may be, you have to make sure that you have that mentor. That is a priority. You don't want to, I understand it happens whenever you're alone, and it impacts your life more when you're alone. But when you have a good mentor in your life, you're able to go through what happened in your past, to kind of go to work through that. You know, maybe a mother-son relationship or a father-son relationship, grandparents, whatever it may be, but please just open up. Everyone experiences, you're not alone, but you can find someone that you can trust. And it's a confidential thing too. So you're able to be comfortable. And that is so important there. But as far as mental health, it's not easy. And I'm a proud person who is deaf and has a disability. It's not having a disability, it's we are all human. We are all the same. So YouTube, please understand how the mental health when it comes to deaf, blind, hard of hearing, and it may be some things that come up with suffering. Mental health does happen and it's fine, but just open up, open your mind, open your eyes, open your heart, open your ears and eyes and listen. So that's what I just wanted to say, and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hector.
There's nothing wrong with you. Let me just tell you, that's the biggest piece of advice. You are perfect just the way you are right now, and the way you are. Change is part of life. Normal is just a setting and a washing machine, and you deserve to be safe. You deserve to be acknowledged, and you deserve to be in the room. You know, and I think it's just, you know, reclaiming that right to be there. You know, definitely the way DeMarco has put it, really kind of highlights is, you know, it's, you're not the only one that's going through something. And even if you are, that doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with you. I am a very, it took me a while to be able to say this, but I really mean it. And it's July, so I can say it. I'm very proud to be a person on the spectrum, to be autistic. I'm very proud to live with my mental health condition, even though it's hard. I get a very different perspective that allows me to do something that not a lot of people can do. And as a hard of hearing person, it has allowed me the privilege to be able to live more than one life at the same time, because I understanding things differently. And you know what? I grew up with deaf people and I'm slowly becoming deaf. That's an amazing thing. I know some people think of becoming deaf as a bad thing. I don't. I think of it as like, wow, I'm becoming deaf. You know, it's like, that's like really, people don't understand that, you know, but it's like, I am okay with not hearing things, and I am becoming more excited as I'm able to understand sign more, because I'm able to, it's like, I'm done giving up. I've lost the ability to hear this, and I'm more like, wow, I can communicate it this way, and I can communicate more with that place. Like, we just had the Special Olympics in Germany this month, and I was able to communicate. Like, there's sign language. There were like 3 different types of native sign language. There was sign language from China and dialects, and it's like the community is just so big, you know. And so I'm really excited. The same thing happens in the mental health community. You know, there's a big world out there that has always been there, and I think we're rediscovering it. And I think, you know, that's what I want folks to know. You know, through the hardships that you're going through the readjustments and pains, you know, it just means that there's more out there for you than you realize. Good things are hard sometimes to find, but they're worth it.
Thank you so much. You know, I just want to kind of sign off with something that you brought out, which is the Native American view on disability, which is that it should really be looked upon as a gift. I think it's so important for people to recognize that whatever your difference is, it really is a gift, and not just to you, but for the people around you, because it helps expand your world. And I think people miss that often, is how much whatever this, thing is that's looked upon as a disability is actually a way for not just the individual, but for the people around that individual to expand their perceptions, expand their thinking, and expand their world. So I thank you all for being a gift to us today, and really being here and sharing your lives and your thoughts and your wisdom with us. It is so, so appreciated. My gratitude from the bottom of my heart. I know you had to give up, some hours in your Sunday, which is not easy to do. So it's so appreciated. It is so appreciated. I would also like to thank our ASL interpreter, Monique. Thank you for being here today. And I want to remind everyone that if you are in need of mental health resources and support, you can call the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health Access Helpline at 1-800-854-7771. I also want to invite you to watch and listen to our other podcast episodes, as well as the other episodes in our YouTube series. These are all access for all programs that are there to address the topics of mental health and wellness as it relates to the deaf, hard of hearing, blind, visually impaired, and physical disabilities communities. For links to the podcast and YouTube videos, feel free to reach out to Cross Cultural Expressions by emailing us at connectwithcce@gmail.com. You can also find links by going to our website at crossculturalexpressions.org. Once again, thank you all for being here, and we hope everyone gets a chance to view all of the YouTube videos and podcasts. Thank you.